Good afternoon, friends. Good morning, wherever you are, or even good evening, depending which part of the world you're coming from. We are delighted to have a range of friends and participants who have signed up for this Interfaith public webinar on just finance and reparations. My name is Sivin Kit. I'm the Program Executive for Public Theology and Interreligious Relations from the Lutheran World Federation, and it's together with the World Council of Churches and the World Communion of Reformed Churches and the Council for World Mission that we are co-organizing this public webinar together. Now, this public webinar is really part of a three-part process where we have two other e-consultations. And what we are focusing on is really on just finance and reparations. And we want to dialogue and learn from diverse faith perspectives and really want to deepen that interfaith cooperation on financial and economic concerns. Now, this is really a follow-up from our ecumenical meeting recently entitled Economy of Life in a Time of Pandemic, held last April. And we want to address these following questions for today. First, what do our faith perspectives have to say on the issue of debt and how it affects people's lives? Second, how can finance and international financial structures be made to align with our faith-rooted values? And then, lastly, how are faith-based organizations responding, and what kind of joint proposals can we put forward to debt action, just finance and reparations towards securing a post-COVID-19, post-debt, post-growth, and life-affirming future? So that's quite a lot to cover, and we have indeed a very exciting panel of speakers with us. And I will be introducing them afterwards. Now, it's unfortunate that one of our speakers who was supposed to provide a Buddhist perspective, who was supposed to be our first speaker, and Lapapan Sapamanta from the Assembly of the Poor is unable to join us due to technical difficulties. And unfortunately, that is the reality that we're in today, often hindered by such difficulties. But we are going in alphabetical order. So unfortunately, we can't have the Buddhist perspective, but if we can get a video from her later, we will try to make that available to you. We will start with a Christian perspective, followed by a Jewish perspective, then a Muslim perspective, and at the end, a Rastafarian perspective. Each speaker would have about 9 to 10 minutes to share, and then afterwards, we will have a discussion with them. Now, you may use the chat box to introduce yourselves and to put your questions there. We prefer you to use that, and my colleague Philip Peacock from World Communion of Reformed Churches will be handling that, and we'll use that for the discussion afterwards to make it simple. So right now, I would like to start with our first speaker, Karen Georgia Thompson, and she's from the United Church of Christ, and she will be starting, and she'll share with us her perspective, her contribution from a Christian perspective. So over to you, Karen Georgia.
Yes, good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are here in the United States or in this part of the world. Thank you for the opportunity to be present in this conversation. And my task is to provide some insights into a Christian perspective on reparations from an African descendant perspective. I want to locate myself in this conversation and give some insight into where I'm coming from in this conversation. I was born in Jamaica and I currently live in the United States. So I consider myself somebody who's of double diaspora, multiple diaspora. I am an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, with my ordination in the Baptist Church. So in that, I walk many spaces and places and understand the world from a particular perspective that is rooted in multiplicity of understanding and self-identification. So in looking at this particular topic, it is hard to come into this conversation and not start from a perspective of African descendant peoples that is rooted in enslavement. The history of African descendant people, both here in the United States and across the Americas, is one that is built on a foundation of enslavement, manipulation of historic truths, and lack of equality and equity. It is challenging to have a conversation about reparations without examining critically the commodification and enslavement of Africans and the free labor that they provided on plantations, and how that built generational wealth for European communities and contributed to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. This free labor and exportation of both products from plantation across the American colonies and the Caribbean down into South America supported the wealth generation that we now see quite evident in European countries. The extraction of human and natural resources from the African continent must be a part of the conversation about reparations. Reparations for African and African descendant peoples must include debt reduction and development that will provide relief for our communities in ways that will build the economies of our communities globally. In an article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote for The Atlantic, he said the following: 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. That is not only an imperative for the United States. I would say, until the global we reckon with our compounding moral debts, the world as we know it will never be whole. Wholeness in this case includes right relationships. Throughout the Christian scriptures, we find texts that speak of right relationships, about reconciliation, texts that point to forgiveness, texts that point to restitution. And it is in those places, perhaps, that we need to ground these conversations about debt reduction and about restitution. In the New Testament, we find in Ephesians chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians chapter 12, compelling arguments about the one body. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 12, it says, just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts from one body, so it is with the body of Christ. We teach that if one part of the body hurts, the entire body hurts. And yet within this body of Christ, we continue to see the historic abuses of African and African descendant bodies. Within this body, we have also seen the use of Christian scriptures to in an abusive way that contributed to actually what we see today by way of the plague that is present in many of our communities. The historic uses of the Bible to strip African and African descendant peoples of heritage, culture, and practices, of resources, and of opportunities for human development is also problematic and requires that Christian communities begin to talk about what restitution looks like, not only from a part of debt cancellation, but also looking at the ways in which African descendant communities continue to be deprived of opportunities to practice culture and heritage in meaningful ways. This too is a part of restitution and reparations. In its call for the International Decade for People of African Descent, the United Nations notes that there are 200 million plus people of African descent living in the Americas. Those 200 million people in the Americas are descendants, primarily descendants of enslaved people brought into these parts of the world. The church has a role to play in calling for reparations and restitution, and the church has to be a part of providing leadership in this movement for reparations and restorative justice. There is a key difference in our teachings between forgiveness and reconciliation, which we need to acknowledge in this discourse. Conversations about reparations in the church and in Christianity sometimes turn to conversations about forgiveness. Putting ownership of the discourse on people of African descent to provide forgiveness to those who have perpetuated wrongs against them. I would name that restitution requires reconciliation. Asking for forgiveness or demanding forgiveness doesn't get us where we need to be. Instead, I would point to the Zacchaeus text, where Zacchaeus stopped and said to Jesus, "Behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham." That's in Luke chapter 19, verses 8 through 9. Restitution demands that we look at what was taken and find ways of giving that back. Not just one time, but perhaps 4 times over. We see across communities unemployment and underemployment. We see lack of education and miseducation, poor housing conditions, lack of wealth and opportunities for wealth generation. And in all of this, we can point to the historic contributions through enslavement that has rendered communities where they are today. So the church, Christianity, has to also look at the ways in which the church profited from enslavement and find its way into the reparations movement and providing restoration for African descendant communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen Georgia, for just starting us off and coming in from a Christian perspective, of course. And one of the things that she highlighted, that this is not just about debt cancellation, but also looking at issues of culture and heritage, and I appreciate that. And also the reminder of how Christians have misused the Bible and misinterpreted the text and used it in ways that really have enslaved others and given reason and rationale to carry out such enslavement. And that is something that we deeply need to repent of. And also, Karen Georgia talked about Zach tax, and I guess during the discussion we'll have more related to that, and we can have more discussing that as well. Now, the second person I would like to invite is David Krantz. And David is the co-founder and president of chairperson of ATZIM, Ecological Judaism, and the national, Okay, yeah, and National Science Foundation Fellow, and he has many things. Just like Karen Georgia, she's the head of the UCC Committee on UN International Decade for People of African Descent. So you have multiple roles as well. So I'm just going to pass the time to you to give us a Jewish perspective on this topic. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you today, representing both 8SEAM, ecological Judaism, as well as being a National Science Foundation Fellow at Arizona State University School of Sustainability. We've got a lot of ground to cover. There's a lot of nuance that I'll end up having to skip over, but this is just to give you a brief overview, basically, of what I'm calling kosher economics. So when we're thinking of kosher economics, we're looking at three Jewish concepts. One is neshech in biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew rebit. One is Shemitah, and one is Yovel. So dealing with each of these separately, neshech. So neshech, or like I said, in modern Hebrew, rebit, literally means interest, interest that one would charge or pay on loans. So it is actually fairly prohibited in Judaism in our biblical texts, right? So here's all the examples throughout the Hebrew Bible that either prohibit or say that that to not charge interest is a wonderful thing, and charging interest is a terrible thing and should be strictly prohibited, right? Ezekiel in particular is very much against charging interest. So he says, who is the person who charges interest? That person isn't going to live. If you charge interest, you're just going to die. So it's a very, very strong rebuke against charging interest. But the other thing that neshech means also, instead of interest, can also mean bite, which makes sense if you think about it, because interest is a form of biting financially, right? So here's where it means biting within the Hebrew Bible. Now, all of these instances, except for in Micah, biting is actually a snake bite. So it's biting, but it's specifically a snake bite. So charging interest is like a snake bite, except for Micah. And Micah here is a little bit stronger, where basically the biting or the interest per se is a means of people erring and doing wrong. And what should we do? We should launch war against those. So that's how strongly the Hebrew Bible is against charging interest. The next ideas we're going to go through here are Shemitah and Yovel. Shemitah literally means release, but you may know of it more commonly in English as sabbatical, the sabbatical year. And Yovel in English you probably know of as the Jubilee year. So here's all the instances of Shemitah and Yovel in the Hebrew Bible. There's 7 instances. So the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, is every 7th year. And the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, is every 50th year. So you have 7 cycles of 7 years, 7 Shemitah cycles, and the 50th year is the following those 7 cycles is the Yovel, the Jubilee year. Now, all these are laws that are written in the Hebrew Bible. So to give you a time element, this is roughly 3,300 to 2,700 years old, these laws, depending upon whether or not you believe the Hebrew Bible was written by God, in which case more around 3,300 years old, or divinely inspired, but not necessarily written by God, and then maybe around 2,700 years old. But either way, still, fairly ancient laws that I'd say are still both relevant and radical today. So what does it involve? Well, one of the things that involves is a release from work, right? Shemitah means release. So we're releasing lots of things. We are prohibited from working the ground, prohibited from farming. And for a an agricultural people to not be working the ground. If you're a farmer and you're not working the ground, you're not working. So it's essentially a year without work in which we're released from work. We're also released from debt. So all debt every 7 years is released. It's just forgiven. So every 7 years, debt is forgiven. Now, again, we haven't been practicing these necessarily the way that the Hebrew Bible says we should, but nonetheless, it's in there, it's in our text. There's also a release from slavery. Slavery in the Hebrew Bible is not meant to be like a permanent condition. It's actually more of an economic condition where people get debts and then they have to work to pay off the debts. Well, if you're releasing debts every 7 years, you're also releasing basically your indentured servants every 7 years. But that is not enough just to release in Judaism, just to release people who were enslaved or indentured servants. They must be compensated for their labor. When people who were enslaved are released, they must be compensated. And then there's also part of this is a preferential foraging for the needy, as well as a redistribution of all land. So getting quickly into all this, right? So taking a break from work releases from all work, but it also extends to non-human animals are also supposed to be able to take a break. Both the animals who would work for you, as well as wild animals, are supposed to be able to rewild into an area. This engenders social equity. A release from debt, again, engenders social equity. All the debt over time just leads to divisions within society, economic classes. And the Hebrew Bible says, no, that's not good. We need people more on an equal playing field with each other. This has been the most inspiring outside of Judaism. Christians in particular have taken this up with things like the Jubilee 2000 campaign that relieved and canceled lots of debt, Occupy Wall Street. It's made its way over into governments have initiated this debt release, again, biblically inspired from the Hebrew Bible. It's been in popular culture where John Oliver last week tonight canceled debt. It made its way to South Park. So this is something, the animated TV show. So this is something that's been very much taken up. What hasn't been taken up necessarily so much has been released from slavery. You might think, that's not a problem anymore. Well, actually, there's an estimated 45 million people worldwide who are enslaved right now. That's estimated more than at any time in history. And we tend not to think about it or do much necessarily about that. The other part is remunerations. So remember that those who've been released from slavery have to be compensated according to Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, must be compensated for their labor. And we have people who have been descended from people who were enslaved largely by colonial powers who were never compensated for that labor and should be. So basically, we have biblical justification for reparations, and it's more than even justification. It's command. Like this is just as serious as any other religious edict that we have. Is that we should be providing reparations for people and descendants of people who were enslaved, and that would be in Yiddish would be called a shanda, a shame. Preferential foraging, again, is something that it puts people on a level playing field, and perhaps land redistribution. This is perhaps again something that engenders social equity, but is also something that's probably the most radical law in the Hebrew Bible, because this is something where every 50 years the Hebrew Bible recognizes, okay, we have a capitalist system, but the capitalist system is far from perfect and needs a check. It needs a balance. And so how do we balance that? Well, one of the big ways the Hebrew Bible balances that is with redistribution of equity. So every 50 years, equity is reset. People who gained a lot more in land, essentially, value equity, right? They need to give some up. And people who've lost a lot of their land, lost a lot of their equity, they get some back. Imagine that, a social equity system that redistributes everything, resets everything every 50 years. A lot of the problems that we have now in society are generational. Wealth is inherited generation to generation, but also being poor also can be inherited from generation to generation. And the Hebrew Bible says, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be where things are reset and things do not get out of hand. We have a capitalist system, but it must be tamed. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to questions in the discussion section.
Thank you, David. And of course, even from David's discussion, sharing just now, you already see how the Bible, and earlier, Karen Georgia already talked about the challenge of how we interpreted that Bible, the text. And here, David also highlighted some of these concepts like Jubilee and where other traditions have been in solidarity and worked together with our Jewish community to uplift those ideas. So thank you very much, David, and we will definitely get back to you. All the speakers are basically laying out some immediate ideas for us. And next, I would like to invite Yusuf. And Yusuf is the author of the book, The Way of Return, Responding to Economic and Environmental Justice Through Wisdom and Teachings of Islam. And of course, he also plays other roles as a trainee Mufti and translator as well. So I'd like to pass the time to Yusuf for you to share with us a Muslim perspective. Thank you, Yusuf. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sivan, and thank you to all the attendees and all the panelists. So I'll just go straight into my presentation. Given that the topic was just finance and repatriations, I wanted to just touch upon the concept of debt. So often debt is seen as a negative, especially in the contemporary world. And so the Islamic position is it depends on what the nature of that debt is. And I'll kind of refer people, given that we're discussing debt, I'll refer people to what I believe probably was the best book written on this topic. That was a book entitled Debt, the First 5,000 Years, written by David Graeber, who recently passed away. So the late David Graeber, who was recognized as amongst the leading expert, if not the leading expert on this topic, as a financial anthropologist who taught at LSE. So one of the things he highlights is that in his book, he says that the whole conception of money as posited in mainstream economics is very different from that construed in anthropology, namely that the conception of money actually existed as credit networks. Most primitive economies were gift-based economies where people would gladly be indebted to their brother because that would augment that sense of connectedness. So being in debt to someone wasn't seen as something bad. Being in debt, provided the spirit of that debt was good, was actually a way of cooperation and relationship. It was only with the advent, what David Graeber would say, of coinage and a specific understanding of money. So he's very strongly against what he considers the myth, the founding myth of economics, that somehow money evolved from barter trade networks to market economies. Rather, what he says was that when specific coinage was introduced in the actual age, this is when, basically to coincide with what some of the speakers have said, slavery itself became a big part of economy. And so then he touches upon, in his book, he provides a whole spectrum of this, but he keeps revisiting this concept of how we have a choice. Trade can be seen either in a format of cooperation or can be seen as in a format of enmity and alienation and separation. And so he very interestingly gives, he cites how Adam Smith actually borrowed analogies given by Islamic scholars such as Imam al-Ghazali and Nasiruddin al-Tusi, which actually were intended to demonstrate that money is a conduit of connection, that as soon as someone hoards money, then they are basically literally embodying a sense of ingratitude for the gift of money, whereas money is being created to be circulated. And that's why the Islamic prohibition of usury, it actually uses the similar word to what David mentioned before, riba, which is kind of similar to ribbit, is an idea of a destructive growth. And so the idea is this, that when a person keeps the money with himself, even though he may outwardly be benefiting, he is facilitating a destructive paradigm for himself and for the larger environment. Now, what David Graeber interestingly says is that when the Muslims were applying their understandings of money and the marketplace, they had a certain understanding of how the marketplace should be a genuinely free market, and there should be no impediments to entry and to exit. Then he mentions how this was actually the example of a free trade, a free market in operation. And effectively, what stopped them resulting in banks, or commercial banks as we would come to know it, was because they took their profit seriously and weren't just motivated by profit, P-R-O-F-I-T. And so he says that ironically was the development of a conception of interest, which is previously, as the previous speaker said, condemned in Judaism. Although in the book of Deuteronomy, there does seem to be a kind of and this is a very impactful verse in the sense that unto your brother you can't charge interest, but unto the Nokri, which is the Gentile, you can. And so there was a kind of a kind of an understanding of certain people you can charge, and that would be the stranger, the enemy. And traditional Christianity, such as St. Ambrose, then expanded the famous Ambrosian exception to say, well, everyone is a brother in this world, and therefore you shouldn't charge usury or interest from anyone. The word usury and interest, there wasn't any demarcation. Usury was any form of profit on a loan. Interest was introduced by a Roman jurist, Hispanus, who said interest is derived from the word interesse, which is literally in between is. It was a way of getting around the prohibition of usury, to say that if I give you a loan and you don't pay back on a certain date, then that gap allows me to charge you a late payment fee. And it was used as a legal ruse alongside other strategies to get around the prohibition of usury. What David Graeber and other people say was that when finally, through the Protestant Reformation, and I noticed this is a lot of the Lutheran church here, Martin Luther played a big role in readapting the prohibition of usury. Even though he was against usury first, he almost, as a reaction to the times, allowed for 5%, and then the final nail in the coffin was laid by John Calvin. And so when this kind of allowance for usury happened, then what I want to say is that the Muslim world would not have allowed for that, because it always understood any charge of money on money is bringing about this destructive paradigm. But once that allowance was made, then that in turn facilitated a chain of events, which resulted in 1694, the world's first, what we would call bank, as we know it, commercial bank, which in the words of David Graeber, inverted all money previously. Whereas money previously to that would be a debt owed to the king. Now the money becomes a debt owed by the king, because the King of England, or the William seeking succession to become the King of England, gives the remit to print money to a band of goldsmiths. And this allows for what we, from that trajectory onwards, allows for what we know as bank credit today, whereas money itself literally comes into existence as interest-bearing debt. Anytime money comes into existence, and most of what we know as money today is money arising through bank lending, it comes into existence at a swipe of a pen or a typing of digits, whereby it comes into existence with there always being more money be left to pay back. Now, there was a time when, post Bretton Woods, when that money was pegged to the dollar and the dollar was pegged to gold, but post Nixon 1970s, wanting to remove that in order to facilitate a war, that was removed. And so we've arrived in a situation which Herman Daly refers to as growth mania, where there is no effective peg. And the only thing that makes us accept these digits that banks produce today as money today is the supposed understanding that it is money, which means it's usually ultimately backed by the imperial power and strength of America. So what happens when we're in a system where money is constantly growing, and it has to grow to survive? As Edward Abbey says, the logic of usury is the logic of the cancer cell. It has to grow to survive. And just as the cancer cell, as it metastasizes and grows in the body, it eventually cannibalizes the body and destroys it, so it is that our interest-based money, which is arising with always a corresponding debt, has long since divorced itself from the real economy and has become a phantom economy. So we can do as many repatriations and just finance as we want until we realize that the nature of the money supply itself creates slavery, requires slavery, led to corporations that were founded on their logic that spread out through the East India Company, the East India Dutch Company, that resulted in the words of Richard Douthwaite, causing Western Europe, which were the pioneers of this bank credit, to have to colonize the world, resulting in Africa. One of the sisters gave a lovely talk on Africa, resulting in Africa literally being strip-mined to the benefit of these Western European countries. Then this system continued. So when the colonization ended, supposedly it only rebooted itself post Bretton Woods to take on the form of multilateral basically organizations supporting these corporations. And we're still there today, and we're waiting for the next reboot. What's going to happen when the dollar finally hyperinflates, when we all realize all of what we took to be money was nothing but digits? What's going to happen then? What's going to happen then is either it'll reboot itself, so someone will hope maybe China takes on that role, or it will completely collapse, and then we'll have to revert back to a more honest and just forms of money. And this is where we as faith communities have a lot to give, because we need to revisit the prohibition of usury and translate that beyond our theological and scriptural commandments into real world understandings where people can see the destruction and the vice that it's caused everyone. And I believe all of us will come to that agreement amongst ourselves. Sivan, how much time have I got left?
You have 1 minute.
Okay, so I'll end this on this point because I think we need to revisit this thing. I mean, the Muslim position is quite categorical, and I believe in my reading almost all faith positions on this was categorical. But alongside the idea of money not being interest-bearing, whether it comes into existence at interest or let's not take interest, but we have to encourage the surrounding marketplace that facilitates free and fair trade. You can't have a free market now, because the freedom that exists today is freedom to exploit. There's a reason why 50 of the largest embodied economic entities in the world are corporations. There's a reason why Walmart has more GDP than Pakistan and Bangladesh combined. There's a reason why no matter how much we speak and how much we have platforms as faith institutions on Davos or any of these things, we're never going to be taken seriously, because there is a systemic structural impediment caused by the system itself. And we need to call out the system from our faith positions, but also from a real world economic position. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf, for really a very rich discussion covering history and also just bringing us back to even the early conception of money that is more gift-based, and how the moment we have coins materially, it changes the way we look at money itself. And also there were a few things that came up, like ideas of cooperation versus competition or enmity, and then later that image of cancer really struck me. That whole destructive nature of our system right now. And I think at the end that you gave us a strong appeal for us to see how our theological perspectives can be translated into actual policies and practices that really make a difference in the real economy, as you have just said. So thank you very much. We will come back. I mean, this is just the start appetizer for us. And I would like to right now invite our next speaker to come forward. Now, Jalani Nia, or Naya, is the coordinator of the Rastafari Studies Unit and lecturer in Culture and Rastafarian Studies at the Institute of Caribbean Studies in the University of West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. And we are really excited to have him with us because unfortunately, we couldn't have the Buddhist perspective earlier due to technical issues, but it's important for us to also look beyond what people usually say is the Abrahamic faith, Jewish perspectives, Christian, and also Muslim perspective. So I think your contribution will be very important for us so that we can learn together. So over to you, Jalani.
Thank you, Chair. Brothers and sisters, I greet you in the name of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie and his wife, Empress Wazira Menin. I want to express thanks to the councils of Christian churches for this forum and the invitation to address you here. I feel, however, that these conversations might be somewhat cliche to address a matter of just finance and reparation, because to some extent, we all know what is good outcome and the level of commitment required to see that through. It's more than 60 years since leaders of the former developing world met in Bandung, Indonesia, and those conversations continued into frenzied hopes of the Group of 77 and various other kinds of regional blocs that tried to engage with this conversation we're having today. This terrain, as far as I'm concerned, is not rocket science. This is a terrain that connects us to human nature and understanding and action. The willingness to live unselfish lives, to harmoniously and equitably share the planet's resources. Rastafari holds the principle that the earth and the people who inhabit, the creative beings that inhabit this space are a part of a common heritage, are a part of a universal heritage that not just mankind, but the whole planetary ecology is important and should be sustained. The cliche is the dissonance between the knowledge and the willingness to undertake the appropriate action. In this presentation, I address the approach of Rastafari to these issues of just finance and reparation through a title of Polite Violence and the Proverbial Apple, Rastafari and Back to Africa as reparations method. Now, the word in the title, polite violence, speaks to this cliche I'm talking about, because the willingness or the desire to make a change feels connected to a theory I was taught by Rasta teacher Mortimer Planner, polite violence, which is how he conceptualizes the British colonial civilizing mission. He interprets this as polite violence to speak to institutional strictures that violently damage, subjugate, dehumanize the people who were under its weight. The apple I talk about is a multivocal signifier, not just a reference to the biblical apple, but also alluding to the company, the largest company in the world, and its symbolic name, Apple, which connects us to that first sin, this notion of enticement, this notion of pleasure. But we also see the apple as the American apple or the Euro-American apple, which has been the source of much distraction and the perpetuation of our people's under development. So first, I'd like to say that Rastafari is notably a new religion, and the ordering of the program this morning is not just one that is alphabetical, but one that is chronological, emerging in the African diaspora in the 20th century rather, out of Jamaica, and one that has overachieved as far as religious developments is concerned within less than 100 years, becoming a worldview infectiously known across the globe, transcending geographies, race, socio-economic backgrounds, and now with adherents numbering anything between 15 and 50 million worldwide. Second thing I'd like to say is Rastafari's origin emerges to channel and facilitate post-colonial transformation of subjugated populations, significantly dehumanized by this colonial civilizing mission. The encounter of Africans who have been transplanted to the Americas and enslaved became narrated as a protracted period of confrontation in the wilderness of the West with a beast which is Babylon, operationalized through combined oppression of church and state working in unison to develop the societies of Europe. Thirdly, Rastafari is a worldview that is a product of faith, anchored in Christian orthodoxy, which is linked to the trusted fulfillment of the prophetic word. This word became the Redeemer King, Emperor Haile Selassie, whose name translated to the power of the Holy Trinity. This sovereign crowned in Ethiopia became the revelation and symbolic fulfillment of the hope of African redemption and reparation. The constellation of over 400 years of colonial American oppressive colonization after a journey that had begun with emancipation in the mid-19th century, enslaved peoples in the British Empire were guided by the actions of this Ethiopian king. And this provided a focal point for the galvanizing of African-centered international liberation and decolonizing movement. So essentially, I'm saying that Rastafari is a product of the post-colonial attempts to transform a colonial situation. So it comes into being with reparations as its intention. Rastafari is very much critical of the kind of Hobbesian economics that suggests that man in nature is nasty, brutish, and thief, and therefore evolved in a kind of mercenary and ungenerous context as far as his human community of brothers and sisters. So to this extent, Rastafari jettisons the colonial project by embracing analysis that centers the world on an Ethiopianism that sees the project of world supremacy as for the concert of nations that we now recognize in the United Nations and all of those developments in decolonization and human rights. Indeed, the emperor's leadership perhaps best crystallizes this conversation in a speech made to the United Nations in 1964, made popular by artist Bob Marley in a song called War, where he outlines that until the color of a man's skin or his eyes are of no greater significance than the color of his skin, rather, there will be war. That as long as there are racial divides and otherizing of humanity in prejudicial ways, there will be a context for disharmony and war. Peter Tosh, in his usual bluntly stated conversation, says everyone is crying for peace, but no one is crying for justice. I don't want no peace. I want equal rights and justice. To some extent, I think the idea of I don't want no peace, I want equal life, rights and justice should preface the trending hashtag Black Lives Matter. so that persons confronted with this assertion understands its fullest context as really a rejection of peace in interest of justice and equality. What is the damage that has been caused by this Eurocentric, white supremacist, Christian-centered approach to African dominance in the West? It has caused a sense of unbelonging. Africans everywhere they exist outside of Africa are deportable or second-class citizens. This is exacerbated by the fact that there is no African dream. There is an American dream. There are European dreams. So Africans cleave to the West in spite of the fact that they are not necessarily embraced there. Marcus Garvey early provides a context for the reparations of the African sense of belonging by insisting that Africans look to the continent, look to their homeland, and to create this homeland to give this anchor of belonging. The sense of capacity has also been destroyed by Europe. And I'm not just talking about the penchant for Afro-pessimism as a way of viewing African potential. I'm also talking about the destruction of the capacity to survive healthy lives based on nutritional provisions, products of slavery, poor diets, which now cause lifestyle issues in the Caribbean. Rastafari, in reacting to these issues caused by cultural genocide, has fashioned its own reaction through its livity, which emphasizes organic food, which is largely described as ITIL. And ITIL is seen as a counteraction to the brined entrails that were product of colonial dietary nutrition for the enslaved people. I see where I'm running out of time. So just to bring my conversation to a closure, there is a sense within Rastafari that reparation is an ethos that is necessary as a part of the concert of nations. Reparations mean that the pride of old money should move to a similar pride to be responsible for the issues that arose through their acquisition of that money. Money in Rastafari is seen as germs. And this is insightful when we think of COVID and money being one of the carriers of the virus. Just to close, I would like to say that international funding agencies will have to decolonize and cease to perpetuate neo-colonial policies and that framework. In fact, those agencies really suggest the kind of behavior that we see now operating out of the United States, which is quid pro quo, kind of trumping of potential across the world. Just finance is not just about finance. It is about fairness, equity, trust, and honesty. And that's what we would like to see going forward. I thank you.
Thank you, Jalani. And of course, I know that you could keep going on. And the moment you start talking about germs, suddenly I thought, okay, this is something that resonates as we are in this time of pandemic. Of course, with all these rich contributions that you have given us, I'm going to call all the other panelists to come forward to join us for a conversation. And they may want to come and share with us what resonates, as they listen to each other, because this is also a learning from one another that we want to have in this session. So there are 4 of you, and Jalani has shared quite another part that's really important about decolonization. And I was really struck when you talked about the different dreams that we all want to have. It's not just the American dream. And the images that you use, whether it's Apple or even, I would be interested to hear more about what does that polite violence look like, in your context, etc. But I'm just going to open it up for all the panelists, perhaps if you like to just, I've asked you to unmute that all of you can unmute to share. Perhaps, is there anything that you felt resonated with you when you're listening to one another? And as I quickly comb through the questions, I'll bring out some questions to you. And I'll probably start with Karen Georgia first, because I think she actually cut her sharing a little bit short. She was the shortest, but there may be some things that she wanted to add that she maybe didn't manage to go to. But maybe as a Christian, you could really start off by sharing, is there anything that resonates with you as you were listening to others? And what thoughts do you have, just to get the ball rolling? Sure.
They all resonated. And it's interesting, for 4 unplanned and unthreaded presentations, that they connected in the way that they did, each touching on a different thing and almost building. So that was very helpful. I want to thank David for his explication of the Hebrew narratives and talking, because I think that the texts that are lifted up there certainly also are a part of the Christian story as well, that we do look to the Hebrew narratives to talk about things like forgiveness and restitution, jubilee. And I intentionally did not touch the Hebrew narratives because I saw that David was going to be on the program. Brother Yusuf, thank you for your presentation as well, which also I think tied in very well with the conversation. And Brother Jelani, as a fellow Jamaican, I think that everything that you pointed to, particularly around the cultural pieces, was also something that I lifted up in terms of the need for restoration. I think the piece around heritage and culture, displacement of peoples in a diaspora context, and the ways in which Christianity has been used to as a tool of oppression, is something that really needs to be on the table for interrogation. And there needs to be an act of repentance around the ways in which Christianity has been at the forefront of what we see. I think that Christianity, when we talk about that, has a particular white Western bent to it, and that's oppositional and has been oppositional to human rights, dignity, freedom, and justice for all people.
Thank you, Karen George, just getting us started, and this is part of the process of us learning from each other. Would anyone else would like to just chip in before I ask some questions? And you can just go ahead, Yusuf.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I think it speaks a lot of Karen to raise that, and also as a committed Christian to raise that question. But I think that question also goes broader, right? Because all of us can use our religions and more so our whatever identity. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can use any religion to buttress that egoic side if we've chosen separation, right? I mean, the deeper core of our religions require a luminosity for us to see what's really being spoken to. There has to be, in the words of Jahlani, faith, fidim, right? What do you really trust? What does it really come down to? And so Christianity was co-opted, Islam's co-opted by other extreme fringes today. But the deeper question that I would come to, especially when you think of colonization and how Christianity became a vehicle for that, because much of it spread out from Western Europe. And so even the Christianity that was purported to be presented was an ethnocentric, and people sometimes can't avoid that, but the ethnocentric Christianity of, Jesus on the cross looking very much like Charles Heston, whatever his name was, blonde, blue-eyed, not the Jesus that you'd expect from Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem, from Palestine. But in any case, when we look at these things and we seek to address the wrongs that were done, one thing to be cognizant is structurally those wrongs are being perpetuated and continuing. And they were continuing because colonization was an imperative brought about by a system which required this outpour of greed, which required this separation, right? This is what interest does, and it associating financial architecture. So the question that I was hoping to pose at the end of my presentation was, alongside seeking of justice, what is it we can do today to redesign our money and our financial institutions and our architecture to ensure, through guidance of our scriptures, but also this felt sense of what's true, that it does become a means of cooperation and connection and can fulfill the Ambrosian idea of universal brotherhood, as opposed to the turning the verse of Deuteronomy on its head and saying there is no kingdom of God here, so we might as well take universal separation and apply this. If everyone says, America first, then by definition, there's going to be someone coming last. So that's the kind of challenge that we face to kind of structure it. So that's the question that I'm going to throw out to the panelists and also to the attendees, that what can we do to redesign? For me, the biggest thing is reasserting the prohibition of interest within a paradigm of what we say, dhaharat al-hikmah. The wisdom behind that prohibition has become manifest in our time. We don't need to go and speculate now. We don't need to revert back to some councils. We can see that and where it's taken us environmentally, where it's taken us there. And then we need to support institutions that encourage collaboration and unity and cooperation. Yeah.
Thank you, Yusuf. David, do you have anything to add on? And then we're going to go into some, pick up some questions and maybe some comments that you all could respond to. And you can see the chat that is flooding with different perspectives also. But just a word or two from you, David.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear from my colleagues. I was struck, Yusuf mentioned America first, and in a way, America is indeed first in incarceration, both in sheer numbers and incarceration rates. First in COVID numbers, in overall numbers, at least for now, still. First in debt. First in all sorts of things that no one should really want to be first in, and it strikes me that a lot of this, both the problems in the United States and around the world, and the problems that we're discussing today, have to do with power and how power corrupts and how power has been used to divide people and to turn people against each other. And so I think that a session like what we're doing today is a good part of that process to how to counteract that. We counteract that power by those of us with little power joining together and ideally convincing enough people with power to also join with us, and then together we can build power, but also a more just and equitable power to reset things the way that ideally they should be, to set things more fairly than they are and have been.
Thank you, David. Now I'm going to just pick out the questions from what I can see here. Thank you, Philip, for just alerting me to that. And I'll go back to Jalani. And of course, we don't have to go in this order. If you just want to say something, just do the traditional raise your hand. I can see you. And then we can just proceed and engage with one another. And of course, we're not talking about necessarily being nice and agreeing with each other. I'm sure there are some nuances that we want to pick on. But Jalani, there was a very pointed question that you mentioned, decolonizing financial institutions. And so perhaps you could start off, and others might have some thoughts on this. Now, what does this mean? Do you have anything you want to say more about it, especially related to reparation?
Certainly. In countries like Jamaica, who have been before the IMF repeatedly, we usually are faced with conditionalities that are driven by very much alien economic principles, believed to be in the best interest of development. And most nations going before this end up having high debt burdens with most of their GDP being exported to service these debts. There is a kind of racist underlying principle that assumes that these countries need to be spoon-fed through these institutions because they're providing funds. Often their conditionalities, as we come to know them, are completely stressful for their populations and push huge sections of those people into poverty. I think that institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank need to solve the problems of the poor without creating more problems. So really and truly what they've demonstrated is that they continue to be extractive institutions, neo-colonial ways of shoring up capitalist economies through that same notion of interest that we were talking about. The fact is that there is a pride within capitalism in being able to profit off of adversity, and the adversity is the poor often. And I'm saying that the decolonization of those institutions really means that they need to see the human community as interlinked, and the extremities between wealth and poverty are the real substance of most of our issues, globally. So I'm really talking about institutions that are governed differently, are guided by different sensitivities and with an intention to really transform these countries. The third world has never had a Marshall Plan, where America provided funds to Europe to ensure that Europe retained respectability. As far as the third world is concerned, your respectability is your indebtedness, and being able to crawl out of that, and prove that you have successfully attuned yourself to these economics.
Would anyone like to add on to this perspective on decolonization? Go ahead, Karen Georgia.
And I'm grateful for that global perspective and how it impacts countries. I think that there's also a way in which our lending institutions also disenfranchise individuals in the process. And it's also a piece of what Jelani is raising here. So let me speak to this particular context in the United States, where individuals, African descendant people quite often end up with loans that are at a higher interest rate, or they have challenges actually getting the loans that they need, right? So we also see this when you're talking about issues around, for example, wealth creation, right? And people moving out of poverty. One of the issues is also here is about home ownership, right? So that's a way that you start to kind of build assets, if you will. And there's a serious disparity in terms of how individuals acquire home loans. In the last housing crash, the people who were disproportionately affected were African descendant people and other people of color who had an extraordinary number of loans that were given at extraordinarily high interest rates. So a lot of those loans that ended up with balloon payments, people ended up losing their homes. If you end up losing your home, then it drives you back into a particular area because you've lost your equity. You've lost, now you have to find some place to live. So those particular cycles are also perpetuations of a system that is not built to actually assist African descendant people, but actually perpetuates a colonial mindset that says that we need to put more into whatever it is that we need to get, and there's no assistance. So we're always going to be struggling that much harder to get that much further than other communities.
There was an interesting comment here. And of course, Yusuf, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to kind of give a twist to the whole idea of the colonial thing, because I think Jalani, when he was speaking about that, this kind of quote came to mind from Neil Ferguson when he was speaking about how post Bretton Woods colonialism needed to be readapted. So he said, the days had gone when investors could confidently expect their governments to send a gunboat when a foreign government misbehaved. Now the role of financial policing had to be played by two unarmed bankers, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Their new watchword became conditionality. No reforms, no money. Their preferred mechanism was the structural adjustment program, and the policies the debtor countries had to adopt became known as the Washington Consensus, a wish list of 10 economic policies that would have gladdened the heart of a British imperial administrator 100 years ago. This is from The Future of Money, and he's quite a big proponent of, capitalism and so on. So the point about, for me, just to unpack the word colonization, because I get what Karen's saying and what Jailani's saying, but to bring it to a wider audience, is that this imperative of colonization was brought about by a system of money, and that is the system of money which requires money to grow. Money has to grow for its survival. And it has a point of its growing and its increasingly receded privileged elite, then there becomes a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And it just so happens that the colored people, and especially the African people, were kind of on that, on the lower end of that curve. And now we find that still being played out within the national economies. So when David, for example, gave the example of America being the most indebted country, he's right, but it's also simultaneously the richest country. The only way that makes sense is when you understand money itself comes into existence as a debt, and it requires more to be paid back. So when we take out, because the way this could play is that when there could be token support systems made, right? So the liberal fringe or the liberal side of what's happening within the power play within America between the Republicans and the Democrats, and this kind of polarization that's happening could be, and it needs to be done. There needs to be an empowerment, but it could play out kind of as a token form without addressing the systemic reasons, right? So, for example, if we replace the color and the ethnicity of someone who's still playing the role of that privileged elite, then it's just the same thing acting itself out, because it needs this kind of system, it needs this kind of separation, and it needs this kind of polarization. So it's really, really important. I seem to be banging on that thing again, for us to look at the structural causes for this, and what are the structural things for this thing continuing. So, yeah.
Just to maybe quote, there's somebody who wrote quite an extended comment and then a question. Maybe it feels like a pushback, but it would be interesting to see how each of you or any of you might want to respond to this. So I quote this, someone said this, it was true that large communities of people were exploited for profit through the colonial machinations, but will not such a return of wealth in any form create further pressure on the peoples who are already a part of a capitalist system within the same colonial power? In other ways, whose responsibility is the international repatriation? So if England compensates India, will not the poor and dispossessed in England pay the heaviest price? Question mark. Any thoughts on that? David, go ahead.
Yes, it's an excellent question, but I fear it's also the sort of thing that can lead to inaction. But they all have the same root of the problem. Like the reason why England is like the poor people in England, or poor people in the United States, or the poor people in any of the wealthier countries are exploited. It's the same reason why poor nations have been exploited by those same countries, right? So it's the root issue is exactly the same, and this hints that really this is a very big systematic problem, right? So we can develop a little thing here or there, but clearly, or even a bigger thing here and there. But clearly, if we're not addressing it systematically, that there will be other unintended problems. A country that doesn't care, for its own people, how much should we expect it to care for other people, right, outside of their own nation? So there's an element of capitalism unchecked that is just, money is about everything and everything else is secondary. And as long as we have that as a societal attitude, I think that we will have problems. But I think we continue to push for systematic change, which is required. And simultaneously, I observe that mostly what we actually achieve is incremental change. But clearly, if we don't push for the systematic change, we won't even get the incremental change. So that leaves, okay, so how do we get to that systematic change? And I think we can get to that systematic change through pushing for it and then noting our incremental achievements. I'm heartened by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who noted that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This is a fight that we will not win overnight. We will certainly not win in this webinar, right? This is something that we need to be fighting on together. And we're probably not even going to solve this in our generation. God willing, inshallah, we should, but we're probably not going to, right? We need to be fighting this from generation to generation, and each generation, ideally, we will get closer to where we need to be.
I already sensed that Jelani was having something to say. Go for it.
I'm optimistic. I realize that the way global events unfold, they're epochs, and I think that sustainable development as an imperative before humanity has to be conjoined with reparation. They're linked. They're not separate. Reparations is sustainable development, meaning that unless we see the need for repair of damages and to hold responsibility for the way, in the Caribbean, 85% of tertiary graduates migrate to the United States and the UK. So it means that what the taxpayer of the Caribbean trains as professionals services the first world, and the first world is not paying for that. We continue to prepare our debt burden, but the first world continues to draw on the brain drain. I'm saying that the way the United Nations exists as a political body of nations, there needs to be a moral obligation that the larger countries, because we already have all of the framework for human sensitivity, for human action. Much of what we have talked about has already been legislated. There are various kinds of subcommittees within the United Nations, but the large countries, United States, Britain, China, Russia, continue to ignore the principles of the majority of humanity. I think the church has been complicitous in not being political enough. And I'm saying that the church had a political mandate, which is why we were enslaved. The missionology, the missionary work that occurred across the world was to support the state's hegemony of subjugated people. Now that we are in this conundrum, the church has to become aggressively active in ensuring that we have deracialized politics and a more equitable human agenda.
Thank you. Now, time is moving very fast, and I think it feels as if we just got the conversation going. But like Jelani said, I think this struck me. You were saying that all these structures are there. Or you were talking about earlier that there's already this knowledge, but we are not moving from the knowledge to act on it, and the call to action is very strong. And if all of us just glance at the chat box, I think there are some of our participants are not only not asking questions, they're actually offering comments and sharing with us what they think is some ways forward. And I guess most important thing is we want to just move into action as well. But today, one of the values of this discussion really is that we are in solidarity together from different religious traditions, different faith traditions. And perhaps each of you could share something a bit more personal of your own journey. And just as a close, what are some closing reflections and comments as you have shared your perspective, you have heard from others, and we have engaged in some brief conversation, because this is really part of a process in Nifea that we would like to encourage, where we want to move towards a joint message from different faith communities, at least speaking out and just articulating some of these thoughts that you have given us. So basically just asking you to give us some closing thoughts, closing comments, either from your own tradition or inspired by what you have heard from others, or even in what ways are you challenged after our conversation thus far. So I'm opening to anyone in no particular order of importance, but Yusuf, you have raised your hand. Go ahead.
I'll just say, because I think this might be a good comment, that when E.F. Schumacher wrote his book, Small is Beautiful, and he had this landmark chapter of Buddhist economics. It's a shame that Anne's not here today, because she could have given us the perspective on that. But interestingly, in his concluding remarks on that chapter, he said, I could just as well have used Christian, Islamic, and because he said the ultimate meta principles of all of the great wisdom traditions that we have are all consistent on this basis. It's an idea of who we are, who God is, how we're connected in this stewardship, we're interconnected in this framework of being, and what that requires from us to do. The specific idea of how the financial world has evolved as Jahlani said, he kind of gave this premise of that Hobbesian world of war against all, that actually arose out of a philosophy of separation. It was backed up by a philosophical framework that was literally separating God from the universe, firstly in the form of a deistic God up there, the watchmaker God, and then relegating that God further and further in a more mechanistic worldview, where God is just, the ghost in the machine, right? All human beings are reduced is this kind of, we're just, to think of consciousness as an epiphenomenon. It's not even real. What's real is immaterial, just basic matter. And this kind of philosophy is what allows for this alienating dimension of finance and economics. And so it's not, even though you brought us from supposedly contrasting spiritual traditions, I'm pretty sure when we come down to the spiritual meta principles, let's take away the theological kind of arguments, like the Quranic paradigm for speaking to the Ahl al-Kitab, which is the people of other religions and traditions, is let's come to common terms of the divine first. Because if we understand the ontological God, the God of being, after that, some of this other stuff can be, you can hold on to your creed as much as you want, but that's a secondary level, right? The first level of that God of being is where we all come on that common terms. And that level of experience allows us to have a shared sense of spirituality in terms of what we think needs to be augmented in this world, right? And so even though I'm coming from the Muslim tradition, and I think there are a lot of amazing structural guidelines and imperatives, I'm pretty sure if I was to share them, or even some of the analogy that Karen gave at the beginning about, she spoke about being one body. This is a prophetic phrase in Islam as well, that the humanity is one body, right? And he was sent to all as a mercy. The word used is rahmah, which means a mercy to all being. And rahmah is an interesting word. It's often understood as mercy and compassion. It really means the love of non-separation, because the best example of rahmah, the Prophet said, was the female womb, where there's a child in that womb, but yet you think there's two, but really there's just one, because the breath of that child is the breath of the mother. So we're never separate from God. God isn't something separate. God is the very ground of our being. And we're being called to realize that through everything we have, through our technology, through our society, through our economics, through our finance, because that's the very basis of life itself, to realize that experientially, not theologically from a mind base, but experientially, to be a witness unto God. And, that's what I think we have in our traditions, in all of our mystic cores of our traditions.
Thank
so
you,
we're just
Yusuf.
being asked to be true to that. Yeah, thanks.
I'll let Jelani have the last word afterwards, but let David or Karen Georgia, any final thoughts from you?
I'll go last, or unless you want me to go now.
Or Karen Georgia would like to share, or Jelani, anyone would like to just give some your final comments?
So in closing, one of the things that I want to point to, because I think it's a good plan, is the CARICOM Reparations Commission 10-point reparation plan. I think it's succinct, and I think it has a lot of merit and substance in terms of what it calls for. I think also this is an interfaith conversation on this particular issue, and I've been asked to speak from the Christian context. And I think that there needs to be some kind of interrogation or exhaustive look at how churches have amassed wealth, right? In the US and in Europe, there are lots of endowments in our churches that are tied to a history that is tainted. And I think that there needs to be some kind of truth-telling that happens in the church, particularly around the global oppressions of people. It is not just an African or an African descendant issue, although it's very glaring there. But similar things also happened across Asia. Someone lifted up issues around India and other parts of the world. And so how can we come to a place of truth-telling and right relationship that actually gets us to a place that says, this is where accountability lies? Because as Jelani pointed out in his presentation, these conversations about reparations are not new. And the question is, how do we move from conversation into some kind of active engagement that allows for the development, the economic development that needs to happen to provide restitution for African and African descendant people?
Thank you, Karen Georgia. Jelani or David, either one of you. Jelani, you can go first.
I want to thank the conveners for bringing this panel of resources together. It's a good way to know who is around us and who we can have this common conversation with. I'm glad to have met my fellow Jamaican, Karen Georgia, and the rest of the panel, David, Yusuf, etc. I am mindful of the fact that Rastafari has a concept of I and I, which is not dissimilar from what we know in South Africa as Ubuntu. Really that I am because of you, and that we as a human planet, not just a human community, but we as a planet are connected to the things around us. COVID is showing us that in a real way. Even the unseen we are connected to. And to that extent, I am suggesting that we need to remember that our skin hues are really very much superficial. But the last thing I want to say is that we have tried the Eurocentric method for the last 500 years. And I think there is an important and urgent need now to understand Africa as method, Africa as root, not just for Africans, but for humanity. And to look at that continent as resourced adequately to solve its problems respectfully, which means centering Africa in all the conversations in the way that Europe has benefited from centering.
Thank you, Jelani. And David.
Well, thank you all so very much. And thanks, of course, to the organizers for bringing us all together. I think I think it's important to note, like as Jelani noted, like we all come from the same place, and we often forget that, and I think that allows us to. It's one of the things that allows us to treat each other poorly when we otherwise shouldn't. And as Yusuf noted, this, we theologically, these are all values that we share across our faith traditions. But obviously, also something that that Karen Georgia brought up. It's like these are still minority perspectives, clearly in practice, if not, yes, our texts and our traditions clearly say this, but in practice, obviously, the most of the people in the world in power are people of faith, in the sense that they hold by a religion, but nonetheless do not practice it this way. And in this sense, we are in the minority of the world of preaching these perspectives, and that can be a very lonely work to do. And so I greatly appreciate the solidarity of being with you all here, because it is exactly this sort of conversation that really helps to keep me going. And the last thing I want to bring up is that I would be remiss not to mention that this is not in a vacuum, that we do not treat each other well as people, as far as the society goes, right? That has other sorts of repercussions, and it's a lot of the same problems that are driving humanity, the way that we treat our earth, our home, and that our poor treatment of the earth also has very negative consequences for us as people, and particularly is a negative complicating factor in it for people who are the poorest among us and the least resourced among us, is our continual neglect of properly addressing climate change and other forms of environmental pollution.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I've brought in a very important person, one of my fellow organizers from World Council of Churches, Athena. And I think on behalf of the LWF, WCRC, World Communion of Reformed Churches, and the Council of World Mission, and WCC, of course, we are grateful to our 4 panelists for giving us so much to chew on, so much to think about. And I think the call to action also was very much present, besides the sense of solidarity that we have with one another. So thank you once again very much. I'll pass the time to Athena as she wraps up. So Athena, over to you.
Thank you really to everyone for a powerful dialogue for transformation. And I just wanted to say, perhaps I should introduce myself properly. I'm Athena Peralta, and I work with the World Council of Churches as Program Executive for Economic and Ecological Justice. I wanted to say that this panel discussion is not just a one-off thing. It is part of an interfaith online consultation on the same theme, comprised of 3 sessions. So we will have 2 further sessions that will go much deeper into the questions that have been raised at this panel. This interfaith e-consultation will critically reflect from faith perspectives on the problem of debt, especially made more urgent now by COVID-19 and also by climate change. We are also going to reflect on alternative pathways for justice and sustainability rooted, in our faith teachings in finance. This consultation will help to identify common ground and possibilities for interfaith action to tackle not just a debt crisis, but also to promote reparations and larger and more deep-seated transformations in our international financial architecture. So more concretely, we hope that at the end of these 3 sessions, we will be able to develop a common message that we can share with our constituencies, but also with international financial institutions. As it happens, the IMF and the World Bank will be having their annual meetings in October, but also with the G20 and their upcoming Leaders Summit in November. So again, thank you so much. And back to you, Sivin.
So thank you once again to all our participants. Please feel free to leave your contact, or if you have any links to your own work in this area. But do remember to send it, to click on to all panelists and attendees. Then everyone can have a quick glance of where you're from and what you are doing. And I'm sure our panelists might be interested to engage with you further. And we will be making this recording available after, probably with some editing in there, just to tighten things up a little bit more. And also there may be some resources that our panelists may wish to share with you. I think they will just send it to us, and we will send a follow-up email with all the necessary information. And of course, once again, thank you, our panelists, for spending this time with us, whether it's the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, and also to all the participants. So we'll just leave the chat for a while so that you can just make some final comments for all the participants. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. So thank you, Jalani. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, David. And thank you, Karen Georgia. And of course, Athena and my colleague, Philip Peacock, and also Peter, who are working behind the scenes. So we are looking forward to keep in touch with all of you. So have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.